My name's Travis Blair. I'm chairing this session. I'm from the Bioprotection Research Centre, and it's my pleasure to introduce our 5 speakers today, all on the protection of our primary industries, which is the engine room of New Zealand. So our first speaker has been mentioned several times already during the course of this conference, Professor Stephen Goldson. So Stephen has had a long and distinguished career looking at biocontrol of weevils and is also acting as an advisor to the Chief Scientist of New Zealand, a senior researcher in AgResearch and a principal investigator in the Bioprotection Research Centre. So today Steve is going to talk on pastures. Are they New Zealand's most neglected ecosystems?
Thank you, Travis. I had a couple of attempts at titles for this talk. One was seen to be business as usual, go away and try again. The other was too controversial and too irritable. So this is a compromise, and I don't wish to be curmudgeonly about things. This is trying ideas out. It's no kind of definitive statement on anything. But I am interested to talk about the state of New Zealand pastures, the level of research into the ecology of New Zealand pastures, and the fact that they cover 48% of the area of New Zealand, and they generate something like $26,000 million a year of income. And my contention is we don't know a whole lot about how they operate ecologically. We know quite a lot about them agronomically. Before I go on, I'd like to share the blame. Barbara Barrett, who's here, Rowan Emerson, who isn't, Steve Ratton, who isn't. And I'm aiming to be provocative, and I've got no problem being criticised or questioned, because that's part of the issue. If I can't answer questions, it's because we haven't done enough work. This is a companion talk to the one Jeanne Jacobs gave this morning, where she talks about rapid evolution in pastures and the apparent appearance of resistance of a parasite to Argentine stem weevil. So as I said, there isn't a whole lot of work going on in pastures, and that may be because they are dismissed as disinteresting. And I spent the first 2/3 of my career wishing to God I worked on grapes or avocados or something other than pasture. It was just the luck of the draw I finished up in pasture. But the last 10 years I've got very interested because they're quite unique. I would go as far as to question whether they are in fact ecosystems at all, or whether they're just assemblies of plants that were deliberately brought in or accidentally brought in that haven't necessarily co-evolved, but grow together in what we call pastures. And the places, if you look at the native range, if you look at England here, and we look at Canterbury, I don't need to describe the difference. The difference is extraordinary. People have said, oh, we can find pictures like this in New Zealand as well, but in general, they're not the same. And I believe that our pastures show very strange ecological phenomena. There is very little biotic resistance to invasive insect species. I don't know about plants. But species of minor taxonomic importance rip into our pastures, and some of you know them: Argentine stem weevil, clover root weevil, a number of other black beetle, all kinds of stuff gets into New Zealand and performs at horrifying levels of destructiveness compared to what goes on in the native range. And the other strange thing is we've had 3 out of 3 biocontrol successes using parasitoid wasps. And that's parasitoid wasp at the picture. It lays its egg in the weevil and kills the weevil through the larvae developing in the body cavity. 3 out of 3 successes is outrageous. The average for biocontrol success of arthropods is 1 out of 10. So this is 1 out of 1,000 chances of us getting this level of success. So there's something funny about New Zealand pastures. And the contention that we are putting forward is that just as the pests don't run into any biotic resistance or natural enemies or competing for niches, neither does the biocontrol agent. So it too shot ahead. Really, and when you think about it, it's obvious, and I'm sure lots of people in AgResearch have pointed it out already, New Zealand is an island ecology. And as a result of that, as I said, we have densities of pests and biocontrol agents way off the evolutionary scale because of lack of impediment to their success. And one of the effects of this uninterrupted level of parasitism and this very high level of activity, we believe, is the acquisition of resistance in the pests, in Argentine stem weevil, to the parasitoid wasp. Basically, the selection pressure has been so high, running at over 70%, often around 90%, for 40 generations against a weevil in an environment where there are very few other species in that niche, meaning there's untrammeled selection pressure, has led to resistance. And that's the first time, it seems, that this has been documented in the literature anywhere. And as I said, Jean mentioned that this morning. So the theory I put forward, which is controversial, is that we have a depauperate ecosystem which allows these pest species to come in, which allows the biocontrol agents to thrive, and which probably engenders resistance. And one of the things I didn't point out is the biocontrol agent itself is parthenogenetic, so it reproduces clonally and can't evolve, whereas stem weevil can. So it's an unequal evolutionary arms race. So there isn't much data, and this is one of the points of this talk. These contentions I'm making aren't necessarily supported by heaps of data. But there are some data. This is a list of biocontrol agents, probably of a descending importance. This is the number of species, not the ground density, but the number of species of these various biocontrol agents, carabids, staphyloinids, ladybirds, in British pasture. These are the number of species we have in New Zealand pasture. I'm sorry, I'll rephrase, that's a big mistake. These are the number of species we have in New Zealand, but not necessarily in New Zealand pasture. These are the numbers we have in New Zealand pasture. And these estimates here have been derived from various sources, wise people. And there's definitely less biocontrol variety in New Zealand pastures than New Zealand pastures. And it's this lack of presence of biocontrol, I think, which demonstrates the very dubious ecological quality of New Zealand pastures. There's a view, and it's probably correct, that in Britain, in Europe, in Northwest Europe, Palearctic, probably farms are interruptions to a sylvan landscape. Basically, which one is it? Basically, what's in here and what's in here is much the same. It's an ecological continuum. So the species are right across European landscape, in the remnant forest areas and in the pastures. The data I just gave to you is based on, that numbers of species is based on 40 years of work by a very odd agency in Britain called the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust. Their job is to make sure that there's lots of birds like pheasants and quail for the upper classes to shoot. And their job is to understand the whole ecological framework of British woodland and cropland. So those data around numbers of biocontrol agents that I showed you are in fact pretty realistic for Britain. So if you consider that picture I showed you of British landscape, and then we look at New Zealand landscape, and this is an extreme example. Here we have a hedgerow, here we have a refugium, call it what you like, and this is what it looks like. Now, the point about the British landscape is that the idea is that the diversity that's in the woodland moves into the grasslands or croplands during the summer and then goes back into the woodland during the winter. So you get a kind of migration of biocontrol in and out of British pastures that simply doesn't go on in New Zealand pastures. And this is quite an interesting illustration. This is some work one of Steve Ratton's students did. Sorry. Here we have distance from the hedgerow, the shelter belt. This is New Zealand. Here we have spiders. And we can see as soon as you get within 5 metres, 10 metres of the shelter belt, that biocontrol population doesn't enter our pastoral ecosystem at all. So talking about the numbers of biocontrol species is also tempered by the behaviour of those biocontrol species. And in New Zealand, I don't think that the refugia or hedgerows, even if they do contain biocontrol species, they don't function as such in our grassland ecosystems. So in a way, we have a kind of collision. If you're looking at the stable Palearctic grassland forest ecosystem, which has co-evolved over, God knows, since the Ice Age, I think there is some kind of ecological stability. Exactly the same ecological stability exists in New Zealand forest ecosystems. I think Eki Brockhoff's shown that invasibility of our indigenous ecosystems is low, and I think that's because we have an evolved, mature ecosystem in those forest areas or tussock areas. And that means that the niches and availability to invade is much less. That stable ecosystem collides literally with an artificial ecosystem, which is our grassland ecosystem. And in fact, they, in a way, to me, seem completely separate. So really, when we talk about, we in AgResearch talk about pasture stability and productivity and so forth, I think a lot of our problems, a lot of them are based on skewed biodiversity. I don't think we have a proper biodiversity at all. And I think we need to look at our pastures intensively to understand more about really what is going on ecologically in our pastures, why stuff's getting in, why pests are outbreaking at such high levels. And we need to look not so much as surveys of species present, but the functional biology of what we have got and haven't got. And I think it's this that is very much lacking in New Zealand environmental research at the moment. So we need to deal with a woeful lack of ecological information. We need to look at more things than we are, including population genetics. Our pastoral ecology is like nowhere else. For decades, we've all been to Rothamsted or Aberystwyth to learn about British pastures, but it doesn't apply here. It's different. And I think we better get on with understanding what's going on in New Zealand grasslands. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a few questions for Steve. Dave? The microphone's just making its way to you.
Pemmin, you know I can't hear.
Stephen, have you considered the speed of land use change in this issue, given that New Zealand has probably the fastest rate of land use change of any developed country, particularly in contrast to Europe? Is that a driver of the evolutionary profile you see?
I think that's definitely part of it. But whether our forests were cleared 100 years ago or 5 years ago, I think the same issues there. There's not the biodiversity migrating from the forest areas into the grassland ecosystem. And that ecosystem is full of holes. And that's the issue I think we need to get into and understand what's going on. And that includes the decline of biocontrol agents because of lack of competition for the selection pressure of the parasitoids.
Peter?
Hi, Stephen. Lovely talk. I think your recent published work in PNAS indicates that actually there's more than a kind of functional interest in this kind of stuff. It's actually a really interesting evolutionary system. Do you think there are many other questions out there that actually there's good evolutionary questions to be asked about New Zealand pasture as a kind of model system?
Are there ecosystems similar to the one we have? Yeah, Hawaii. Any ecosystem like that is wide open. And interestingly, the only other example of where there is resistance to a biocontrol agent is in Hawaii. And that's where a fly was attacking a cricket, and it was drawn to the cricket species because it stridulates. After 20 generations, that fly couldn't find the cricket because it had been selected for to stop stridulating. It happened twice. And I think it's very analogous to here.
One last question up the back.
Kia ora, thank you for a great talk. That was really informative. I'm not a scientist, so please forgive my question if I'm off topic, but I wanted to know, what do you think the possibilities are for co-benefits between supporting the biodiversity that might, encourage resistance to pest species, and also conservation benefits in those shelter belts or other patches on private farmland?
Well, that's an excellent question. We can create replica shelter belts, right, to those which I showed in merry old England, but there's nothing in them that's going to deal with the sort of pests we've got in grasslands. So we can create the appearance, but not the ecology. The other problem we have is, yes, we can bring in lots of species of biocontrol agents, but we all know there's huge risks there about non-target impacts on non-pests, on native species. And we can, quite rightly, people argue, we can increase the variability of plants in pastures. But what happens in the grim commercial world of farming in New Zealand, it turns out that usually ryegrass and clover dominate, they do best. And there's been repeated, well-intended and energetic efforts to bring in other pasture plants, but it doesn't seem to be that they persist.
Right, we'll have to move on. Thank you, Steve.